If you walk into almost any art gallery in the world, right, and you look at a classical painting of the Crucifixion,
Yeah, you're usually looking at something that's, well, biologically impossible.
exactly, it's totally biologically
Right.
impossible because the artist, they'll almost always show the nails driven straight through the center of the palms.
Right. Which we know now just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. Anatomically speaking, a nail through the palm of a hand, uh, it just cannot hold the weight of a human body.
It would just tear right through.
Right. Gravity and just the sheer mass of the victim would simply tear that iron spike straight through the fleshy tissue, right between the metacarpal bones between the fingers.
And the body would just fall.
Exactly. The body falls.
Yeah.
Which means that for, 2,000 years, our dominant visual image of history's most famous execution has been, well, completely biologically wrong.
It's really a striking disconnect, I mean, between the theology, the art, and just the stark anatomical reality. We are so accustomed to these sanitized, kind of symbolic depictions of this event that the brutal mechanical physics of how it actually happened, they just get entirely lost.
They really do. And today, we are looking past the paintings, past the symbols. Welcome to the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We are examining an enormous compilation of historical, biblical, archaeological, and medical sources today, all anchored by the exhaustive, heavily cited Wikipedia article on the subject detailing the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah, the source material here is just massive.
It really is. I mean, we've got the four canonical Gospels. We have writings from ancient Roman and Jewish historians like Tacitus and Josephus. Plus, we have these amazing archaeological finds from the first century and decades of really rigorous modern medical and forensic analysis.
And, the sheer volume of that material, it's staggering. You aren't just looking at medical data here.
Right.
You're looking at texts that have been translated, interpreted, debated, and just layered with immense cultural meaning over millennia.
Oh.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Muddy waters is a great way to put it. And because of those muddy waters, we really need to establish our mission up front for you, the listener.
Yeah, we have to set some parameters.
Exactly. Because this is an event with massive, world-altering theological significance. I mean, people have debated the spiritual implications for centuries.
No, entirely.
But today's deep dive is highly specific. We are actively stripping away the theological debates. We are not here to endorse or debate any religious doctrine.
Right, that's not what this is about.
No, we are focusing strictly on three things. First, the sequential timeline of events as recorded in the ancient texts. Second, the extraordinary environmental phenomena that supposedly accompanied the execution. And third, the rigorous modern medical analysis of exactly what happened to the human body on that cross.
Basically, we're taking a forensic approach to antiquity.
I love that, a forensic approach.
Yeah, we're looking at the biomechanics of an execution method that was perfected by an empire and the physiological response of the human body to that trauma.
Okay, so let's unpack this because, where do we even begin with an event that has so many moving parts?
Well, the image we all know starts at the cross, right? But the trauma didn't actually start there.
No, not at all.
To understand the medical trauma at the very end, like the ultimate cause of death, we have to first look at the sequential timeline that began the physical degradation of the body long before the crucifixion itself.
Right, the execution was really just the culmination of a systematic breakdown of the body.
Exactly. So according to the historical sources, we pick up the sequence right after Jesus was tried before the Sanhedrin, that's the Jewish assembly, and subsequently sentenced in the court of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate.
Okay.
And the physical toll begins almost immediately with a Roman scourging.
And the sources are very clear here that Roman scourging wasn't just, a standard whipping.
Oh, no, not at all.
It was a highly calibrated preliminary torture, right?
That's a good way to describe it. The instrument they used was typically called a flagrum.
A flagrum.
Okay. Yeah. And this was a short whip equipped with multiple braided leather thongs. But the key detail is that interspersed within those leather braids were small iron balls or sharp pieces of sheep bone.
Wow.
Yeah. The intent of a Roman scourging was never just to cause pain. It was specifically designed to flay the skin, shred the underlying skeletal muscles, and literally bring a victim to the very precipice of death.
That is just horrific.
The tissue damage was catastrophic. But more critically, from a medical standpoint, it caused massive, massive blood loss.
Right. So before the victim even takes a single step toward the actual execution site, their body's already entering the early stages of shock.
Exactly.
Think of it like starting an ultramarathon when you've just been in a severe car accident.
That's a really good analogy.
You've already lost a dangerous amount of blood, your back muscles are physically shredded, you are likely severely dehydrated from the stress of the overnight trials, and now the Roman military hands you heavy timber and forces you to carry it.
Right through the crowded, narrow streets of a first-century Middle Eastern city.
The forced march.
Yeah, and that forced march took place along a path traditionally known as the Via Dolorosa, which translates to the Way of Grief.
Okay.
And a crucial point here, the timber wasn't necessarily the entire cross. The sources indicate it was likely just the patibulum.
The patibulum being the horizontal crossbeam.
Yes, and that beam alone weighed anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds.
That is incredibly heavy, especially in that condition. So you, the listener, imagine standing in that crowd along the Via Dolorosa. You have this intense heat of the Judean day, the deafening noise of the spectators.
Yeah.
Some are mocking, some are mourning, the smell of dust and blood.
Yeah, the sensory overload would be overwhelming.
And above all of it, you have the strict, unfeeling efficiency of the Roman military machine just pushing this procession forward. It's an impossible physical demand.
It really is.
And the narrative texts align perfectly with the physiological reality here. The exertion becomes too much. Jesus collapses under the weight.
Right. And this collapse introduces a really fascinating logistical and, frankly, psychological element of Roman execution.
Oh, how so?
Well, when he can't physically carry the timber any further, the soldiers don't halt the procession. They don't offer medical aid.
Right. Of course not.
Instead, they compel a bystander, a man named Simon of Cyrene, to carry the crossbeam the rest of the way for him.
Which raises a really interesting point, I think. If the Romans wanted a highly visible public execution, if the whole point of crucifixion was to serve as a gruesome billboard for state power, why force a dying, severely compromised prisoner to carry their own heavy cross?
You mean if they might just die on the road?
Exactly. Wouldn't a premature death ruin the spectacle the state was trying to create?
Well, that assumes the cruelty was distinct from the logistics. But in the Roman penal system, the cruelty was the point.
I see.
The physical carrying of the patibulum was a profound psychological tactic. It was all about public humiliation and breaking the victim's spirit.
Showcasing their absolute subjugation to the state.
Precisely. If the prisoner collapses, it only further demonstrates their ultimate weakness and the empire's total power. And the act of dragging a random civilian, like Simon of Cyrene, out of the crowd to carry the execution instrument, that perfectly illustrates the absolute unchecked authority the soldiers wielded over the occupied population.
They could just pull anyone in at any moment.
Exactly. Now, along this grueling route, the Gospel of Luke notes a very specific interaction. Jesus interacts with a crowd of mourners, addressing a group specifically called the Daughters of Jerusalem.
Right. And this is a critical textual detail, right?
Right.
Because it differentiates these local Jerusalem women from the women from Galilee who the texts note had followed him and were later present at the execution site.
Yes, that distinction is important in the sources.
Yeah.
But the interaction itself is really striking because of what is said.
Yeah, he tells them, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children.
Right.
He issues this grim warning about future days of such terrible suffering that people will ask the mountains to fall on them and the hills to cover them.
And what really stands out there from a physiological perspective is the cognitive awareness.
Oh, absolutely.
Despite the catastrophic blood loss, the shock, and the physical collapse, the text portrays a figure who is still highly lucid.
Yeah, capable of delivering a complex, ominous prophetic warning to a specific demographic in the crowd.
Exactly. It's a testament to the sheer endurance being described.
So this grueling march eventually reaches its destination. They arrive at a site outside the city walls, and in the local Aramaic, it's called Golgotha.
Yes.
And when the texts were translated into Latin, the word became Calvaria, which gives us the English name Calvary, and the literal translation of that name is place of a skull.
Finding the exact historical location of Golgotha has been just a massive archaeological endeavor.
I can imagine.
The debate primarily centers between the traditional site, which is now enclosed within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and an alternative rocky outcropping further north known as Gordon's Calvary.
But the name itself, place of a skull, has generated a pretty fascinating historical debate regarding its origin, hasn't it?
Oh yeah. The sources outline three primary theories for the name. The first one is the most literal and, frankly, the most gruesome.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because it was an established site for public executions, the ground might have been literally strewn with the skulls of previous victims.
Just skulls everywhere. That's, bleak.
Well, while that sounds entirely plausible from a Roman perspective, I mean, they frequently left bodies on crosses to be consumed by scavengers as a final post-mortem humiliation. The sources note a major cultural conflict with that theory.
Right, because of Jewish burial laws.
Exactly. Judea in the first century operated under strict Jewish burial laws. Leaving human remains exposed, particularly skulls, would severely defile the land according to Jewish tradition.
So local authorities wouldn't have stood for it.
Right. They would have vehemently opposed an open-air charnel house so close to the holy city.
That makes a lot of sense. Which I guess makes the second theory much more pragmatic.
It does. Calvary might have simply been named after a nearby cemetery, a place where skulls were buried rather than scattered.
But there's a third theory, right? And it's the one most widely favored by modern geographers and historians.
Yeah, the topographical theory. This suggests the name place of a skull was derived entirely from the physical contour of the land.
Like, it literally looked like a skull.
Exactly. It was likely a rocky knoll or a small limestone hill that, through natural erosion, just physically resembled the shape of a human skull.
That feels very plausible.
Mm.
Regardless of how it got its name, though, arriving at this rocky outcropping marks the grim transition from the preliminary torture to the execution itself.
Yes. The forced march is over. We have reached the site.
Which leads us directly into the method and manner of the execution. Because, as we've established, crucifixion wasn't just a haphazard killing. It was a highly engineered, methodical system of death.
It was a machine. And before the actual nailing commences, the sources record an interesting chemical intervention.
Right.
The Roman soldiers offered Jesus a drink.
The texts describe it as wine mixed with myrrh, or in some accounts, gall.
Yeah, and the base of this drink was very likely Posca.
Posca. What's that?
Posca was a cheap, sour wine mixed with water that was just the standard daily ration for Roman soldiers. It was acidic, which helped kill bacteria, and it provided basic calories.
Okay, but the addition of myrrh or gall is the crucial detail here, right?
Absolutely. Myrrh and gall were commonly understood in antiquity to have mild analgesic or narcotic properties.
So it was like a painkiller.
Basically. They were intended to slightly dull the senses, perhaps just to make the victim somewhat more compliant during the excruciating process of being affixed to the wood.
But the texts specifically note that after tasting it, Jesus refuses to drink it.
He does. And by rejecting the narcotic, the narrative implies a conscious, intentional decision to endure the full, unmitigated sensory reality of the execution.
He wasn't going to numb it.
Right.
So, with the drink refused, the soldiers begin the mechanics of the cross. And here we have to look closely at the terminology used in the ancient sources, because the words themselves have sparked modern debates about what the structure actually looked like.
Yeah, the linguistics here are really interesting. The Koine Greek terms used in the original New Testament manuscripts are stauros and xylon.
Stauros and xylon.
Right. Now, if you look at earlier Homeric forms of Greek, the word stauros simply meant an upright stake, just a single vertical pole used for fencing or palisades.
Okay.
And the word xylon was a general term for wood, referring to a live tree or cut timber.
Right. And because of those early root meanings, some modern groups, most notably Jehovah's Witnesses, maintain that the execution instrument was a single, upright torture stake without a crossbeam,
Yes.
with the victim's hands nailed directly above their head.
Linguistically, if you just isolate the root words, that interpretation is possible. However, language evolves.
Right. Words change meaning.
Exactly. And by the time of the 1st century, Koine Greek used stauros to encompass a variety of execution structures, including cross shapes.
That makes sense.
More importantly, we have to look at the historical context provided by people who actually lived during the era of Roman crucifixion. Early Christian writers from the 1st and 2nd centuries invariably describe a two-beamed structure.
Like who?
Well, for example, the Epistle of Barnabas, written very early on, likens the shape of the execution instrument to the Greek letter tau, which is a capital T.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, uses a rather graphic culinary analogy.
Culinary.
Yeah. He compares the structure to the way a sacrificial lamb is roasted on two spits arranged in an intersecting cross shape.
Wow. Okay, that's vivid.
And Irenaeus explicitly describes a structure with 5 extremities, 2 in length, 2 in breadth, and 1 in the middle.
So those contemporary historical descriptions overwhelmingly point to a structure that utilized a horizontal crossbeam, the patibulum attached to a vertical post the stipes.
Exactly. The evidence heavily favors the cross shape.
Once the structure is established, we face the grim reality of how the human body was fastened to it. Which brings us back to that biological impossibility in the art galleries we talked about at the top of the show.
Right, the nails in the palms.
Right. If you can't drive a nail through the palm of the hand because it won't hold the weight, how did the Romans actually do it? Modern forensic analysts and anatomists have studied this extensively, haven't they?
They have. And the leading medical theory focuses on a specific anatomical gap in the human wrist known as Destott's space.
Destott's space.
Yeah, Destott's space is a small, natural opening located between the capitate and lunate bones in the carpal region of the wrist.
Okay.
And Roman executioners, through brutal trial and error over decades, were likely trained to find this exact spot.
It's terrifying to think about the trial and error that went into that. So what happens when they use that spot?
If you take a heavy, square-forged iron spike and drive it directly through Destott's space, something terrible but highly efficient happens. The spike passes through without fracturing any of the carpal bones.
Which actually perfectly aligns with the biblical prophecy noted in the Gospel of John, right? That not a single bone of his body would be broken.
Exactly. But because of the incredibly strong ligament band that locks those carpal bones together, a nail driven through that specific space provides a secure, weight-bearing anchor capable of holding the human body.
It holds the weight. But there's a trade-off, is there?
A horrifying one. The agonizing trade-off is the neurological damage.
Right.
Driving a large, rough iron spike through Destott's space would severely graze or entirely crush the median nerve.
And the median nerve is what?
It's the primary sensory pathway for the hand. The damage would cause intense radiating waves of burning pain. Neurologists actually have a name for this condition. It's called causalgia.
Causalgia.
Yeah, and it causes shooting pain up the arms and straight into the chest.
It literally redefines the word excruciating. I mean, the word excruciating comes from the Latin excruciare, which translates to out of the cross. That specific agonizing nerve pain is the very origin of the concept of excruciating agony. Every single time the victim shifted their weight, that severed median nerve would grind directly against the coarse, rusting iron of the spike.
It's almost unimaginable. Now, there's also an alternative anatomical theory regarding the upper limbs.
Okay, what's that?
The Greek word for hand, chair, was somewhat broader in antiquity and could encompass the entire forearm from the fingers all the way up to the elbow.
Oh, I see.
So some medical historians suggest the nails might have been driven between the radius and ulna bones of the forearm rather than the wrist.
That would also hold the weight, presumably.
Yes. Additionally, historical records indicate it's highly likely that ropes were used in conjunction with the nails. Ropes binding the arms to the crossbeam would help manage the massive weight distribution and prevent the flesh from tearing entirely.
And listener, this isn't just medical speculation either. We actually have physical, archaeological proof of how the Romans nailed people to crosses.
We do, and it is one of the most stunning archaeological finds of the 20th century.
Yeah, in 1968, construction workers who were excavating an area northeast of Jerusalem, they discovered a first-century ossuary, a bone box.
Yes. And inside were the remains of a man named Yehohanan ben Hakol.
And he was a victim of Roman crucifixion.
He was, dating precisely to the 1st century. This discovery was a landmark event because it provided the first tangible, physical confirmation of Roman execution methods.
And what exactly did they find that proved it?
What they found was his right heel bone, the calcaneus, and driven straight through the lateral side of that heel bone was a massive iron spike nearly 5 inches long.
Oh my God, just still in the bone.
Still in the bone. And the reason it was still there is that when the Roman executioner hammered it through the foot and into the olive wood of the cross, the tip of the iron spike hit a hard knot in the wood and bent into a hook shape.
Oh, wow.
So when it was time to take the body down, they couldn't pull the nail out. They literally had to cut the wood away and bury him with the spike and a piece of the olive wood still attached to his foot.
That is just incredible. It definitively proves that the Romans nailed the feet to the timber.
It absolutely does. And the placement of the feet brings us to a highly debated and honestly deceptively cruel structural element of the Roman cross.
The hypopodium.
Yeah, so the hypopodia.
A small wooden block or footrest attached to the vertical post. Now, to a modern observer, the idea of providing a footrest to someone being tortured to death sounds contradictory.
It sounds almost merciful, right?
Exactly. It sounds like giving them something to rest their weight on, taking the immense strain off the arms and shoulders.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The hypopodium was not an act of mercy.
Not at all.
It was an instrument of prolonged torture, exactly the opposite of mercy.
How does that work?
Well, as we will explore in depth when we get to the physiological causes of death, the primary and most immediate challenge of crucifixion is not bleeding, it is breathing.
Breathing. Okay.
When you are suspended by your arms, the weight of your body pulls down on the pectoral muscles, effectively locking the chest cavity in a state of permanent inhalation.
You're stuck breathing in.
Right. To exhale, to simply push the air out of your lungs, you have to relieve the tension on your arms by pushing up with your legs.
So if there is no footrest, your legs tire rapidly. You can't push up, your chest remains locked, and you suffocate relatively quickly. The execution is over in a matter of hours, or perhaps less.
Precisely. But if the executioners nail your feet to a solid wooden block, you have leverage. You can push up, you can exhale, you can take a breath.
Okay.
And because you can breathe, you can stay alive for hours or even days, locked in an endless, agonizing cycle.
Oh, man.
Pushing up on the nail in your feet, grinding the median nerves in your wrists against the iron, gasping for a single breath of air, and then sinking back down in sheer exhaustion until the lack of oxygen forces you to do it all over again.
So the Romans engineered the hypopodium specifically to prevent a quick death. They used it to prolong the agony to the absolute maximum limit of human endurance.
Yes. It is a dark, staggering testament to the cold efficiency of the Roman penal system.
That is just horrifying.
It is. So once the victim is affixed to the cross, locked into this highly engineered posture of suffering, the texts note two final administrative acts by the soldiers.
Right. First, fulfilling another prophecy from the Psalms, the soldiers divide his garments, casting lots for his seamless inner tunic, so as not to tear it.
And second, they affix the titulus.
The titulus being the official notice of the condemned man's crime.
Yes, they affix it to the cross above his head.
Then the sign reads, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And it is written in 3 languages, right? Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, ensuring that everyone passing by could read the charge.
Right.
But it's fascinating how even this wooden sign becomes a venue for political maneuvering. The Gospel of John records that the chief priests of the Jews were furious about the wording.
They definitely were.
They went to Pilate and complained, saying, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews."
And Pilate's response is brief and definitive. What I have written, I have written.
It was a calculated, final political jab at the local religious authorities, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Pilate was essentially broadcasting their supposed king as a beaten, naked, crucified criminal, humiliating the very leadership that had pressured him into the execution.
Wow. And with the sign affixed, the mechanics are complete. The highly engineered posture of the cross dictates exactly how long the victim can survive, which brings us to the agonizing timeline of the crucifixion itself and what transpired during those hours suspended in the air.
Yeah, and tracking the exact timeline presents a classic textual challenge for historians. If you read the 4 Gospels closely, you immediately encounter a chronology discrepancy.
Right. Let's talk about that. The Gospel of Mark states clearly that the crucifixion began at the 3rd hour, which in ancient timekeeping translates to roughly 9 a.m. Right.
Yes, roughly 9 a.m.
And that death occurred at the 9th hour, or 3 p.m., so a 6-hour ordeal on the cross.
However, the Gospel of John presents a very different timeline. John places Jesus still standing before Pontius Pilate mid-trial at about the 6th hour, which is noon.
Noon.
The obvious historical problem is, how can the execution begin at 9 a.m. if the trial is still ongoing at noon?
Right, that makes no sense. So how have scholars and theologians tried to reconcile this over the centuries?
Well, one of the most prominent theories revolves around competing systems of timekeeping in the ancient world.
Competing systems, like time zones.
Kind of. The argument posits that John, writing later and to a different audience, might have been utilizing the official Roman system of timekeeping. Roman civil time began at midnight.
Oh, I see.
So if John is using Roman time, his 6th hour would be 6 a.m. for the trial before Pilate.
Ah, and that timeline leaves plenty of room for the scourging, The March and the Crucifixion to begin by 9 a.m., aligning perfectly with Mark.
Exactly. Conversely, Mark is understood to be using traditional Jewish timekeeping, which started counting the hours at sunrise, roughly 6 a.m.
So Mark's third hour is 9 a.m., and his ninth hour is 3 p.m.
Right.
But our sources also highlight that many modern biblical scholars reject that neat reconciliation entirely, don't they?
They do. They argue that we are making a fundamental error by taking 21st century precision, where we all have atomic clocks perfectly synchronized on our smartphones, and projecting that expectation backward onto antiquity.
That is a crucial point regarding historical analysis.
It is. First century people did not have standard synchronized timepieces. The average person tracked time by simply looking at the position of the sun. Time was frequently approximated to the closest 3-hour period, dawn, mid-morning, noon, mid-afternoon.
Right. So demanding minute-by-minute consistency across ancient texts written decades apart by different authors targeting different audiences is just applying an unfair modern metric.
Exactly. The overarching historical consensus remains solid. The event took place on a Friday, stretching through the primary daylight hours of the middle of the day.
Okay, so during those agonizing hours in the middle of the day, Jesus is not isolated. The texts record that he is crucified between two convicted criminals, often referred to as thieves or rebels.
Right.
And across the different gospel accounts, there is a record of 7 specific statements made by Jesus while hanging on the cross. These are traditionally known as the 7 last words.
Yes. And these sayings provide a really interesting narrative window into the psychological and physical state of the victim, and they're scattered uniquely across the Gospels.
How so?
Well, Luke, for instance, is the only writer to record the plea for the executioners. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
Okay.
Luke also provides the detailed interaction with the two thieves. One hurls insults, while the other, the penitent thief, rebukes his companion and asks to be remembered. Jesus responds with the promise, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Wow. And the Gospel of John offers incredibly intimate human details amid the grand theology, doesn't it?
It really does. Jesus looks down from the cross and sees his mother, Mary, and the disciple whom he loved. He actively provides for her future care, saying to his mother, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother."
That's a very striking moment of clarity.
Yeah. John also records the stark physical statement, "I am thirsty," which prompts the soldiers to offer him a sponge soaked in wine vinegar. And finally, John records the triumphant declaration, "It is finished."
But of all the 7 statements, the most heavily analyzed by historians and linguists is the climactic cry recorded in both Mark and Matthew.
Oh, undoubtedly.
The cry of dereliction. He quotes the opening line of Psalm 22, and the text preserved the exact language he used. He didn't speak it in Greek or Latin. He spoke it in the local Galilean dialect of Aramaic.
Right. My God, why have you forsaken me?
This specific Aramaic cry is a massive focal point for historical Jesus scholars.
It is. Geza Vermes, who was a highly respected historian of religion, analyzes this phrase using the historical criterion of embarrassment.
The criterion of embarrassment.
Yeah, it's a tool historians use. Vermes notes that this phrase is remarkable precisely because it lacks the neat, triumphant theological packaging of the other sayings.
It's just raw.
Exactly. Compared to serene sayings about forgiveness or the confident promise of paradise, a public cry of utter abandonment is, in Vermes' words, unexpected, disquieting, and in consequence, more probable.
More probable because early Christians attempting to invent a purely triumphant narrative of a divine being wouldn't likely fabricate a moment where their Savior feels entirely abandoned by God.
Right. It bears all the messy, uncomfortable hallmarks of a genuine historical memory, a true cry of despair.
To really grasp the weight of that cry, you have to think back to the brutal mechanics of the cross we just discussed. Your chest cavity is locked. To speak a single sentence, you cannot just casually open your mouth. You have to endure the burning agony of pushing your shattered feet against the wooden hypopodium, driving your weight up, grinding the raw, exposed nerves in your wrists against the iron spikes, just to draw enough breath into your lungs to force air over your vocal cords.
It's exhausting just to describe it. Every single syllable spoken on that cross required a monumental act of physical agony.
Which means none of these 7 statements were casual remarks. If the physical cost of speaking is that catastrophically high, the words chosen were highly intentional.
Exactly. It transforms the cry of abandonment from a purely spiritual lament into a visceral biological reality. The despair is being forced out of a physically suffocating, failing body.
And as we track this timeline, as the physical vitality of the victim fades from the 6th to the 9th hour, the text reports something startling. The environment itself, the natural world around the cross, begins to mirror this dark culmination.
Yes. The sky and the earth start reacting violently. The historical texts transition here from biological trauma to reported extraordinary cosmic occurrences.
Cosmic occurrences.
Yeah, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all unanimously report that a profound darkness covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. From high noon until 3 p.m., the brightest part of the day, the sun's light failed.
And it wasn't just darkness. The Gospel of Matthew records a cascade of terrifying environmental anomalies.
Matthew reports a sudden earthquake so severe that rocks split open. Inside the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the massive thick veil separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies is miraculously torn in two from top to bottom.
And doesn't he say something about graves?
Yes, Matthew even goes as far as to report that graves broke open and resurrected saints walked into the holy city.
These are immense reality-bending claims, and naturally, for centuries, historians, astronomers, and geologists have attempted to interrogate these texts, searching for non-biblical historical corroboration or modern scientific data to explain them.
They definitely have. And the search for corroborating the darkness began very early in Christian history. Writers like Origen and Sextus Julius Africanus scoured the records of pagan historians to prove the event was a documented global phenomenon.
Who do they look at?
They specifically referenced Greek historians named Phlegon and Thales.
Okay.
These historians had allegedly written about a great darkness and severe earthquakes occurring during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius Caesar.
The initial intuitive explanation for many ancient writers was a solar eclipse, wasn't it? A total eclipse would certainly cause darkness at noon.
Right, but Africanus himself, writing in the 3rd century, pointed out the fatal astronomical flaw in his Pierce theory. The crucifixion undeniably occurred during the Jewish festival of
The
Passover.
Passover is calibrated to the lunar cycle, right? It always occurs during a full moon.
Yes, and a solar eclipse can only occur during a new moon when the moon passes directly between the Earth and the sun. So a solar eclipse during Passover is astronomically impossible.
Impossible, got it.
However, modern scientific inquiry didn't abandon the astronomical angle. Researchers at Oxford University, specifically Colin Humphreys and Graham Waddington, along with physicist Frank Close, explored a different celestial event.
A lunar eclipse,
Exactly.
what we commonly call a blood moon.
Precisely. Using modern astronomical models, Humphreys and Waddington calculated the exact lunar cycles of the 1st century. And they confirmed that on Friday, April 3, 33 AD, which is widely considered one of the 2 most historically probable dates for the crucifixion, a partial lunar eclipse did indeed occur.
Wow. Okay.
And crucially, it would have been visible in Jerusalem just after sunset as the moon was rising above the horizon.
They even point to textual clues for this, right? Some of the oldest extant manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke use a specific Greek word that translates to the sun's light failed or was eclipsed.
Yeah, the researchers theorized that early scribes might have tweaked the text over time, perhaps confusing a lunar eclipse at dusk with the darkening of the sun earlier in the day.
But that still leaves a massive gap. A lunar eclipse happens at night. The Gospels explicitly state the darkness occurred from noon to 3 p.m.
Yes, and this discrepancy leads modern biblical scholarship to approach the text through a different lens. Not as a literal meteorological logbook, but as a sophisticated literary genre.
How so?
Many contemporary scholars view the 3-hour darkness as a prime example of Jewish eschatological imagery.
Meaning it's a literary device used to communicate theological truth rather than literal weather.
Yes. In the ancient world, across various cultures, cosmic anomalies were the standard literary vocabulary for communicating world-altering events. It wasn't just a biblical convention.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Roman and Greek writers like Plutarch, Virgil, and the Jewish historian Josephus utilized the same imagery. When a great king dies or a cataclysmic shift in history occurs, the heavens are described as reacting in mourning or judgment.
So the sun darkening is a symbolic, universally understood way of expressing that a profound tragedy is occurring on Earth.
Exactly. It signifies a cosmic, spiritual reality rather than a specific weather report.
Okay, so what does this all mean? We can perhaps view the darkness as a powerful literary metaphor. But what about the earthquake?
Right.
You can use a metaphor to describe the sky, but an earthquake leaves physical geological evidence in the ground. You can't just chalk tectonic shifts up to a literary device.
And this is where the modern science gets incredibly compelling. There is physical geological evidence.
Really?
Yes. Geologists have analyzed seismic data from the Dead Sea region, specifically focusing on sediment cores extracted from an area called Engedi, located near Jerusalem.
But how do sediment cores lock in a history of earthquakes?
It's a fascinating geological process. The sediment at the bottom of the Dead Sea builds up in distinct alternating annual layers, much like the rings of a tree.
Oh.
These layers are called varves. When a significant earthquake occurs, it disrupts the settling of these layers, creating a distinct, twisted chronological marker in the mud that geologists can read thousands of years later.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And when they counted the varves back to the 1st century, what did they find?
The geologists confirmed that a massive regional earthquake, measuring at least a magnitude 5.5 on the Richter scale, struck that specific area.
5.5 is pretty significant.
Definitely. And based on the sediment layers, they dated the earthquake to have occurred between the years 26 and 36 AD.
Which perfectly brackets the governorship of Pontius Pilate and the exact historical window of the crucifixion.
It does. The authors of the geological study laid out two highly probable conclusions based on this. Either this 5.5 magnitude earthquake is the exact seismic event reported in the Gospel of Matthew, and it remarkably happened on the very afternoon Jesus died.
Right.
Or, alternatively, the author of Matthew borrowed the cultural memory of this massive, terrifying regional earthquake that occurred around the same time period.
Ah.
The writer then layered that genuine historical trauma into the crucifixion narrative to heighten the dramatic and theological impact of the moment.
I mean, think about how we, as modern humans, process and remember massive historical trauma. When people recount their experiences of the September 11th attacks or the assassination of JFK, they almost always anchor their memories with the weather.
That's very true.
It was such a clear, cloudless blue sky that Tuesday morning. Or, if a tragic event happens during a fierce storm, the storm becomes psychologically fused with the tragedy in the collective memory.
Exactly. The psychological impact of the execution of Jesus was so profound for his early followers that they associated the genuine, terrifying natural anomalies of their era, like a massive earthquake and a blood moon, directly with the event in their cultural memory.
It is a deeply human way of processing the incomprehensible.
It is. But regardless of whether the darkness was a dense Khamsin sandstorm, an astronomical eclipse, or a profound theological metaphor, the physical reality hanging on the Roman cross was rapidly reaching its absolute biological limit.
Right. Following the 3 hours of darkness, the earthquake, and the final agonizing Aramaic cry of dereliction, death finally occurs. The sheer trauma of those 3 hours leads to the ultimate forensic question. When the final breath was drawn, what actually killed him?
Right, because as we said earlier, crucifixion is a method of torture. It is not a specific biological cause of death.
This brings us to the medical aspects, diagnosing an event from antiquity down to the cellular level.
To understand the specific mechanism of death, we have to look at a final, crucial detail provided in the historical narrative. As the 9th hour passed, the Jewish leaders approached Pilate with an urgent request.
What was the request?
The next day was not just a regular Sabbath, but a high Passover Sabbath. According to Jewish law, bodies could not remain hanging on a tree overnight, especially not on a high holy day, as it would defile the land.
So they requested that the deaths of the 3 crucified men be artificially hastened.
Right. And the Romans had a very specific, brutal procedure for speeding up a crucifixion. It was called Crucifixion.
Crucifixion, what does that involve?
A soldier would take a heavy iron mallet, a Crucifixion club, and violently shatter the tibia and fibula bones in the victim's lower legs.
Oh, God.
And we return to the deadly physics of the hypopodium, the footrest.
Right, because if your leg bones are shattered, they can no longer bear weight.
Exactly. If you cannot push up, you cannot relieve the tension on your chest, you cannot exhale. Once the legs are broken, the agonizing cycle of pushing up to breathe ends instantly, and fatal asphyxiation occurs in a matter of minutes.
That's horrifyingly fast. The soldiers execute the Crucifixion on the 2 thieves, shattering their legs and bringing about their rapid deaths.
Yes.
But when the soldiers come to the center cross, they observe that Jesus is already dead.
There is no need to break his legs. But Romans are thorough.
Very thorough.
To definitively ensure he is dead and inadvertently fulfilling yet another ancient prophecy that none of his bones would be broken, a Roman soldier takes his heavy infantry spear and thrusts it upward into Jesus' side.
Tradition later names this soldier Longinus, doesn't it?
It does. But it is the physiological reaction to this spear thrust, recorded exclusively in the Gospel of John, that is paramount here. The text reports a highly specific, seemingly bizarre medical detail.
Yeah, that the spear thrust brought a sudden flow of blood and water.
Blood and water. That specific, peculiar detail was recorded by a first-century observer who almost certainly had no understanding of internal thoracic anatomy. They just wrote down what they saw.
But that simple observation has provided modern doctors and pathologists with the precise forensic key needed to unlock the actual cause of death.
It really has. Over the last 2 centuries, many prominent physicians have taken up this diagnostic challenge. One of the earliest comprehensive medical studies was published in 1847 by a physician named William Stroud.
And Stroud proposed the ruptured heart theory, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
He argued that the extreme compounded physical and emotional stress of the ordeal caused the myocardial tissue, the heart muscle itself, to literally burst.
So he literally died of a broken heart.
That's how it was framed, yes.
Yeah.
Stroud interpreted the blood and water as evidence of this catastrophic cardiac rupture, spilling its contents into the chest cavity.
And Stroud's theory was highly influential and popular for over a century, largely because it sounded so poetically tragic. But modern cardiology and forensic pathology have largely moved past the ruptured heart theory, haven't they?
Yes, they have. They view it as biologically unlikely under these specific conditions. In 1986, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a landmark, peer-reviewed paper by Dr. William Edwards.
Dr. Edwards.
Right. Dr. Edwards proposed a much more comprehensive, biologically sound theory, cardiovascular collapse.
Cardiovascular collapse.
Yes. In medical terms, this is known as hypovolemic shock.
Okay, let's break down the biology of what is happening here. Hypovolemic shock occurs when the body suffers a massive, dangerous drop in overall blood volume.
Exactly. Let's trace the timeline back. Jesus was severely beaten, subjected to a brutal Roman scourging with a flagrum, losing a tremendous amount of blood before the march even began.
He was denied water, perspiring heavily under the sun, suffering severe dehydration.
Right. And when your blood volume drops that drastically, your body goes into severe emergency mode. It begins desperately stealing fluid from your surrounding tissues to try and keep the heart pumping and the brain oxygenated.
So your heart rate skyrockets, a condition called tachycardia, right?
Yes, tachycardia. The heart beats faster and faster to circulate the dwindling supply of blood, but the heart is pumping a system that is running dry.
Think of the heart like a mechanical pump, operating in a basement that is slowly flooding with water. As the body tries to compensate for the extreme shock, clear, watery fluid begins to pool in the membranes surrounding the vital organs,
You develop a pleural effusion.
which is fluid gathering in the cavity around the lungs.
Exactly. And you develop a pericardial effusion, which is a buildup of clear, watery fluid gathering inside the sac that encases the heart. As this fluid builds up, it puts immense external pressure on the heart.
So the pump is trying to expand to move blood, but it is being physically crushed by the water surrounding it.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this physiological reaction explains the spear wound perfectly.
Oh, I see where this is going.
When the Roman soldier thrust the spear upward, likely under the ribs on the right side, the iron blade pierced the lung cavity and penetrated the heart.
Right.
First, it released the accumulated clear, watery, pleural, and pericardial fluid, which the ancient writer describes as water.
And this was immediately followed by the dark, coagulated blood from the right atrium and ventricle of the heart.
Exactly. A first-century fisherman writes down that he saw blood and water flow from the wound because, to the naked eye, that is exactly what it looks like.
He had no idea he was inadvertently providing 21st century forensic pathologists with the exact textbook symptoms required to diagnose terminal hypovolemic shock.
It is a remarkable, chilling intersection of ancient, uneducated observation and highly complex modern pathology.
It really is.
But Dr. Edwards didn't believe shock was the only factor at play. He, along with Dr. Pierre Barbet, a prominent French chief surgeon who studied crucifixion extensively, also championed the mechanism of exhaustion asphyxia.
Dr. Barbet's theory focused on the mechanics of breathing we discussed earlier. He hypothesized that the agonizing effort required to push up on the nailed feet to exhale, eventually compounded by the massive blood loss and shock, led to total muscular failure.
Right. The victim simply became too exhausted to lift their own body weight to draw another breath, and they suffocated.
But science requires more than hypothesis. It requires rigorous testing. And this brings us to the extraordinary research of Dr. Friedrich Züge.
Yes, Dr. Züge was a forensic pathologist and an experienced medical examiner who actually found Barbade's theories lacking empirical evidence.
So over the course of several years, Züge actually ran controlled physical experiments to test the mechanics of crucifixion, didn't he?
He literally hung human volunteers from a cross in his laboratory.
That is just wild to me.
Using strict medical protocols, of course, safety harnesses, and modern physiological monitoring equipment, he secured healthy volunteers to a sturdy wooden cross at specific mathematically calculated angles.
Both with and without their feet secured to a hypopodium.
Yes. He meticulously measured the physical pull on the arms, the oxygen saturation levels in their blood, and their subjective reports of pain and breathing difficulty.
And his findings completely upended the prevailing medical consensus at the time.
They did. Züge concluded that if a victim's arms are outstretched at a specific angle, specifically between 60 to 70 degrees, and their feet are supported by a nail or a block, asphyxiation is not actually the primary cause of death.
His monitors proved it. The volunteers, while uncomfortable, were absolutely able to maintain adequate oxygen levels. Breathing was labored, yes, but it was not impossible.
Right. Züge argued that death by rapid asphyxiation on a cross only occurs if the victim is hung with their arms positioned directly overhead vertically with 0 foot support.
He compared that specific vertical posture to the brutal Aufbinden torture method used by the Nazis at the Dachau concentration camp, right?
He did, where victims were hung by their wrists directly above their heads, causing rapid suffocation.
But the Romans didn't use the Aufbinden posture. They used the T-shape, or the lowercase t-shape, spreading the arms out at that 60 to 70 degree angle.
Exactly. Züge realized that the Romans had perfected the geometry of the cross. They discovered the exact anatomical angle that allowed the victim to continue breathing, thereby maximizing the duration of the torture.
Because of these findings, Züge leaned much more heavily toward traumatic shock as the primary cause of death, rather than asphyxiation.
Yes. The sheer overwhelming pain of the median nerve damage, the severe dehydration, the massive blood loss from the scourging, and the physical trauma of the position eventually caused the cardiovascular system to completely shut down.
So after centuries of debate, where does modern medicine finally land? The most comprehensive and widely accepted modern medical view comes from a 2003 collaborative study by historian François Rétif and physician Louise Sillier.
They reviewed all the ancient Roman pathology texts and all the modern forensic experiments.
And their conclusion was that searching for a single cause of death is missing the comprehensive brutality of the execution. There was no single cause.
No. It was a deadly overlapping cocktail of catastrophic systemic failures.
It was a combination of severe hypovolemic shock from the scourging, the grueling exhaustion asphyxia from the physical posture, acute heart failure from the pericardial effusion, and highly likely fatal cardiac arrhythmias triggered by the extreme stress, pain, and profound electrolyte imbalance from dehydration.
The human body simply collapsed inward under the weight of multiple simultaneous catastrophic failures.
This diagnosis strips away the centuries of gold-leafed art and pristine marble statues. It grounds the entire narrative in a brutal, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable biology.
It does. And that is a reality that completely shifts your perspective on the history.
We are so heavily conditioned to view this event within a sanitized, purely symbolic context. We see gold crosses on necklaces, beautifully lit Renaissance paintings with calm faces and floating angels.
But walking through this step-by-step medical breakdown forces a confrontation with the severe biological reality of ancient Roman execution.
It was dirty, it was agonizingly slow, and it was biologically devastating.
It was not a spiritual abstraction. It was the physical reality of the empire's ultimate weapon of terror.
Which brings us to the culmination of our journey today. We have unpacked an incredible density of information, navigating the murky waters of historical forensics.
We covered a lot of ground.
We traced the grueling, blood-soaked path of the Via Dolorosa, examining the psychological warfare and subjugation tactics embedded in the Roman March.
We dug deeply into the horrific biomechanics of the cross itself, exploring the anatomy of distal space, the neurological torment of the severed median nerve, and the cruel, life-prolonging engineering of the wooden hypopodium.
We navigated the hours of reported cosmic phenomena, analyzing the astronomy of lunar eclipses and the hard geological evidence locked in the seismic varves of the Dead Sea.
And finally, we zoomed all the way into the cellular level, successfully diagnosing hypovolemic shock and pericardial effusion from the observations of a 2,000-year-old text.
It perfectly demonstrates just how many distinct, rigorous academic lenses you can use to examine a single historical event. You need history, linguistics, classical astronomy, sedimentary geology, and forensic pathology just to scratch the surface of what happened on that hill.
It's truly interdisciplinary.
But before we conclude, building on that massive foundation of biomechanical and historical evidence we just laid out, there's one final, incredibly fascinating historical contradiction embedded in our sources for you to mull over.
Yeah, this is a really interesting twist.
We've just spent the last hour detailing in agonizing forensic depth the excruciating physical reality of this execution. The blood loss, the severed nerves, the pleural effusion, the asphyxiation, the sheer biological trauma.
Right.
Yet the historical sources note that almost immediately in the centuries following the event, human beings started actively trying to erase that physical reality.
It is perhaps the most intriguing psychological twist in the entire historical narrative. You were referring to the early Gnostic Christian sects and later Islamic traditions.
Exactly. Our sources detail that several early Gnostic groups, holding to a theological doctrine called Docetism, actively and vehemently denied that Jesus suffered on the cross physically.
Right. They taught that his physical body was merely an illusion, a semblance of flesh.
In their view, he didn't really bleed, he didn't really have his nerves crushed, he didn't suffocate.
And centuries later, mainstream Islamic traditions, interpreting specific passages in the Quran, teach that Jesus ascended to heaven without ever being crucified, and that God miraculously transformed another person, some traditions suggest Judas Iscariot or even Simon of Cyrene, to look exactly like him and die in his place on the wood.
From a historical perspective, these aren't just differing opinions, they are theological rescue missions.
They really are. And it raises a profound psychological question. Why is the human mind so deeply, inherently uncomfortable with the physical suffering of its revered divine figures?
We just spent an hour proving the undeniable biomechanical reality of what happened, backed by archaeology and pathology, and yet entire massive theological movements were born specifically to deny the very physical trauma we just explored.
It's as if, presented with the forensic X-ray, human nature cannot handle the image.
We desperately want the divine, the holy, to be completely immune to the dirt, the blood, and the catastrophic failure of the human condition. When the X-ray clearly shows the jagged, broken bone of biological reality, a significant portion of humanity prefers to look away, close their eyes, and insist the bone was never there to begin with.
It highlights the eternal tension at the heart of this event, the friction between the messy, agonizing biological reality of human history and the pristine, untouchable symbols we try to make out of it.
A perfect thought to leave on. Thank you for joining this deep dive into the historical, physical, and medical realities of antiquity. Keep questioning the layers behind the stories we think we know so well. Until next time.